What if you're not lazy at all? You know that feeling. There are things you need to do, important things, and you want to do them, but you don't. You just lie there, scrolling, thinking about it, hating yourself for not starting. And the longer it goes on, the heavier it feels. So you tell yourself, I'm just lazy. I have no discipline. Something's wrong with me. But what if that's not true? What if the problem isn't you, but something happening inside your brain? Because here's the part most people don't realize. Your brain might be shutting you down on purpose. Not because it's broken, not because you're weak, but because it thinks it's protecting you. And if that's true, then this isn't a discipline problem. It's a protection system. So the real question is, why would your brain try to stop you from doing the very things you want to do? So if it's not laziness, what is it? Because it doesn't feel like protection. It feels like failure. You sit there doing nothing, watching time pass, knowing you should move, but you don't. That doesn't feel like survival. That feels like something's wrong. But here's what's actually happening. Your brain isn't asking, do you feel motivated? It's asking, is this safe? And when the answer is no, even slightly no, it doesn't push you forward. It pulls the plug. Your brain hits a kind of shutdown mode when it feels overwhelmed. Not dramatic, not obvious. Just enough to slow you down, blur your thinking, make everything feel heavier than it should. And suddenly, even simple things feel impossible. So you stop. Not because you decided to, but because something in you made that decision first. Which leads to a different way of seeing this. You're not stuck because you're weak. You're stuck because your brain thinks you're in danger. But that raises a bigger question. What kind of danger could make your own brain work against you like this? Why does your brain choose to shut down instead of pushing forward? Because it actually has three options. When your brain detects stress, it can do one of three things. It can fight, it can run, or it can freeze. Most people understand the first two. You feel pressure, you push harder, or you feel pressure, you avoid it. But there's a third response that's quieter and much more confusing. Freeze. It doesn't look dramatic. There's no panic, no visible reaction. You just stop. Your body feels heavy. Your mind goes blank. Even deciding what to do feels like too much. And here's the key part. This isn't random. When stress exceeds what your brain thinks you can handle, it disables action entirely. Not partially, completely. It's like a system overload. Instead of letting you keep going and risk damage, your brain shuts things down to protect you. Like a computer that overheats and turns itself off. And in that moment, doing nothing isn't a failure. It's a response. A very specific one. Because from your brain's perspective, doing nothing is safer than doing the wrong thing. Which means this state you've been calling laziness might actually be your brain trying to save you. But if that's true, then what exactly is your brain trying to protect you from? Why does this happen so often in modern life? Because the environment we live in never really turns off. Think about it. There's always something telling you to do more, be more productive, wake up earlier, optimize everything, improve faster. And at the same time, you're constantly seeing what everyone else is doing, their progress, their routines, their results. Even when you're resting, your brain is still processing all of that. Now here's the problem. Your brain wasn't designed for constant evaluation. It wasn't designed to feel behind every single day. But that's exactly what modern life creates. A quiet, continuous pressure. Not enough to trigger panic, but enough to never feel safe. And your brain reads that as a signal, not as motivation, but as a threat that never ends. Your brain interprets constant pressure as a continuous threat. So instead of pushing you forward, it tries to protect you from it by slowing you down, by making things feel heavier, by keeping you from engaging at all. Which changes the entire picture. You're not failing at life. Your brain is reacting to overload. But that leads to something even more interesting. Why do the people who care the most often struggle the most to take action? Why do ambitious people struggle the most with inaction? You'd expect the opposite, right? More goals, more drive, more action. But that's not what happens. Because the more you care, the higher your standards become. You don't just want to do the task, you want to do it right. You want it to matter. You want it to be worth it. So you build the perfect plan, clear goals, detailed steps, a vision of how it should all play out. On the surface, that sounds like motivation. But inside the brain, it's processed differently. Your brain doesn't just see the goal, it evaluates the risk. How likely is this to succeed? How much effort will this take? What happens if it fails? And when the goal is big, but the path feels uncertain, your brain doesn't get excited. It gets cautious. Because big goals with low certainty trigger threat, not motivation. So instead of pushing you forward, your brain holds you back. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to make starting feel harder than it should. You hesitate. You overthink. You delay. And the more important the goal is, the heavier that resistance becomes, which leads to a strange pattern. The higher your expectations, the more your brain resists starting. Not because you don't want it, but because your brain isn't convinced it's safe to try. And if that's how your brain decides when to act, then what determines whether it gives you the energy to begin at all? If you have energy, why can't you use it? Because your brain doesn't treat energy like something to burn. It treats it like something to protect. Think of it like a budget. Every action costs something: attention, effort, focus. And before you even move, your brain runs a calculation. Is this worth it? What's the return? How likely is this to work? You don't feel this process, but it's happening in the background every time. And if the answer isn't clear or the outcome feels uncertain, your brain doesn't invest. It hesitates. Not because you're tired, but because it's not convinced. Because your brain doesn't release energy unless it predicts success. And when it can't predict success, it does the safest thing it knows. It holds back, which creates that strange experience. You have energy, you're not physically exhausted, but you still can't start. And that leads to a realization most people miss. You're not out of energy. Your brain is refusing to spend it. But then something else happens. Even when you're stuck, you still reach for something easy, something immediate. And that's where the real trap begins. Why does scrolling make you feel worse instead of better? Because it feels like rest. You're not working. You're not thinking too hard. You're just watching. Clip after clip. Quick, easy, effortless. And for a moment, it actually feels good. But something subtle is happening underneath that. Every time you scroll, your brain gets a small hit of dopamine. Not a lot, but fast and repeated. And your brain loves patterns like that. Short-form content is designed for it. Quick rewards, constant novelty, no effort required. So your brain starts adjusting. Because when dopamine hits come too frequently, your brain protects itself. It turns the sensitivity down. This is something researchers call downregulation. In simple terms, your brain stops responding the same way. High dopamine stimulation lowers your sensitivity to normal rewards. So things that used to feel okay now feel flat. Starting a task, reading, working through something slowly, all of it feels heavier than before. Not because the task changed, but because your brain did. And now there's a gap between what your brain is used to and what real effort requires. So you go back to what's easier: more scrolling, more quick hits, more instant relief. And without noticing it, you reinforce the loop, which leads to a difficult truth. The more you scroll, the harder it becomes to take action. Not because you lost discipline, but because your brain is being trained to avoid anything that isn't instantly rewarding. And if that loop keeps repeating, what happens when rest starts draining you instead of restoring you? Why does this loop feel impossible to break? Because it doesn't look like a loop at first. It looks like relief. You feel tired, overwhelmed. So you reach for something easy. You scroll. Just for a few minutes. No pressure, no effort. But a few minutes turn into more. And when you stop, something feels off. You don't feel better. You feel heavier, more drained than before. So what do? You avoid the task again, because now it feels even harder. And the cycle repeats. Tired, scroll, feel worse, avoid. And each time it runs, it gets stronger, because your brain starts associating effort with discomfort and scrolling with relief. Even though that relief isn't real, because your rest is actually exhausting your brain further. Not physically, but chemically. So instead of recovering, you're depleting the very system you need to act. Which leads to the part that feels the most frustrating. You're trying to get out, but everything you do to feel better pulls you deeper in. You're not recovering. You're digging deeper. So if willpower isn't enough to break this, what actually can? What if you could override your brain in seconds? Not by forcing yourself, not by waiting to feel ready, but by interrupting the pattern before it takes over. Because here's what usually happens. There's a moment, right before you avoid the task, right before you reach for your phone, right before you decide, I'll do it later. It's quick, almost invisible, but that's where everything shifts. Because once your brain starts generating reasons, it's already too late. So the goal isn't to fight the reasons, it's to cut them off. And one of the simplest ways to do that is to count backward. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And then move. Immediately. No thinking, no negotiating. Because counting backward does something very specific. It interrupts automatic avoidance patterns. It forces your brain to switch modes, from reacting to deciding, from hesitation to action. And that tiny shift is enough, because once your body starts moving, your brain begins to follow, not the other way around, which flips everything you've been told. You don't wait for motivation to act. Action comes first. Motivation comes after. But here's the problem. Even if you can start, how do you stay in that state long enough to actually continue? Can you switch your brain into focus mode instantly? Because starting is one thing, staying engaged is something else. You've probably felt this. You begin a task, for a moment you're in it, and then your mind drifts. Your attention spreads out. Everything feels a little blurry again. That's not random. It's actually tied to how your brain uses vision. When your attention is scattered, your eyes tend to do the same. Wide, unfocused, taking in everything. And in that state, your brain shifts toward relaxation, lower alertness, lower urgency, which is great for rest, but terrible for action. So the question is, can you reverse that on demand? Here's where it gets interesting. If you take a small point, a word on a screen, the tip of a pen, a spot on the wall, and you will lock your eyes onto it for about 30 to 60 seconds, something changes. Subtle at first, then clearer. Because narrowing your vision activates alertness chemicals in the brain, chemicals linked to focus, to readiness, to engagement. It's like adjusting a camera lens. Everything sharpens, your mind follows your eyes, and suddenly, you're not drifting anymore. You're here. Which leads to a shift most people miss. Focus isn't something you force, it's something you trigger. It's not mental effort, it's a biological switch. But even if you can start, and even if you can focus, why does it still feel so hard to come back the next day and do it again? Why do you lose motivation the next day? Even when you made progress, even when things were going well, you sit down again and it feels heavier, like you're starting from zero. That doesn't make sense, right? If anything, it should be easier the second time. But here's what most people do. They push until they're done, or until they're exhausted. They try to finish everything in one go. And in the moment, that feels productive. But your brain doesn't see it that way. Because when you use up all your energy, your brain links that task with fatigue, with effort, with strain. So the next time you approach it, it hesitates. Not because you're lazy, but because it remembers how it felt. Now here's the part most people don't realize. Your brain remembers unfinished tasks more strongly than completed ones. There's a kind of tension that stays open, a loop that isn't closed, and your brain wants to resolve it. Which means, if you stop at the right moment, not at the end, but somewhere in the middle, you leave that loop open. You walk away knowing exactly what comes next, and your brain holds on to that. It keeps pulling you back, which creates a very different experience. Instead of resistance, you feel a subtle push to continue, a kind of unfinished momentum. So stopping early doesn't slow you down. It does the opposite. Stopping early makes you want to come back. But there's something that can break all of this, no matter how good your system is. Something much quieter and much more damaging. Why does being hard on yourself make things worse? Because it feels like it should work. You push yourself, you criticize yourself, you try to wake yourself up. And for a moment, it feels like control, like you're taking responsibility. But notice what happens after. You don't feel energized. You don't feel clear. You feel heavier, more stuck, less willing to try. That's not a coincidence, because your brain doesn't interpret self-criticism as motivation. It interprets it as threat. And here's where it gets more serious. There's evidence that the part of your brain that processes physical pain also activates when you attack yourself mentally. So when you say things like, "What's wrong with me? I'm so lazy. I should be better than this," your brain reacts as if it's being hurt. Not metaphorically, but neurologically. Which means every time you try to push yourself with negativity, you're adding more stress to a system that's already overwhelmed. And what does your brain do under stress? It shuts things down. It protects. So instead of moving forward, you go deeper into the same state you're trying to escape, which leads to a hard truth. You're not motivating yourself. You're injuring your brain. So if pressure makes it worse, what actually helps your brain feel safe enough to start again? What actually helps your brain recover? If pressure shuts it down, then what brings it back online? Because doing more of the same clearly doesn't work. Pushing harder, thinking harsher, demanding more, that just deepens the loop. So what does your brain actually need? Not more force. It needs safety. Because when your brain feels safe, everything changes. Your thinking clears. Your focus returns. Your energy becomes accessible again. And here's the key. Safety isn't something abstract. Your brain reads it through signals. The way you talk to yourself. The way you respond to failure. The tone inside your own head. If that tone is harsh, your brain stays on guard. But if that tone shifts, even slightly, something opens. Because safety signals restore cognitive function. They tell your brain, you're not under attack anymore. And only then does it allow you to re-engage. Which reframes something most people misunderstand. Being kind to yourself isn't about lowering standards. It's about removing threat. Kindness isn't weakness. It's fuel. But even with the right internal state, there's still something in your environment that can pull you right back into the same loop. What if you didn't need willpower at all? Because most of the time, you're not losing to yourself. You're losing to your environment. Think about it. You're tired. Your phone is right next to you. One tap and you're gone. No decision, no effort. That's not weakness. That's design. Your brain always takes the easiest path available. So if distraction is easy and action is hard, your brain already made the choice. Which means the real question isn't, how do I become more disciplined? It's, what is my environment making easy? Because your environment controls your behavior more than your mind. So instead of fighting yourself, you change the setup. First, remove temptation. Not by resisting it, but by making it invisible. If your phone isn't in reach, your brain stops thinking about it. Out of sight isn't just a saying, it's a neurological shortcut. Second, Reduce friction. Make starting almost automatic. Lay things out in advance. Remove decisions. The less your brain has to think, the more likely it is to act. And third, change the default. What happens when you do nothing? If doing nothing leads to scrolling, that becomes your baseline. But if your environment shifts that default, even slightly, your behavior follows. Because your brain doesn't want to work harder, it wants to work easier, which leads to a very different conclusion. You don't need more discipline. You need better design. But even with the right system, there's still one question left. What does all of this actually say about you? So what does all of this mean about you? After everything we've just unpacked, the shutdown, the resistance, the loops you keep falling into, what does that say about who you are? Because it's easy to land on the same conclusion. I'm just not disciplined. I'm the problem. But look at the pattern again. Your brain shuts down under pressure. It avoids what feels unsafe. It responds to overload. It reacts to how you treat it. It follows the environment around it. None of that points to something being broken. It points to something working exactly as it was designed to, which leads to a different answer. Nothing is wrong with you. Your brain isn't broken. It's trying to protect you, using the only rules it knows. And when those rules are based on pressure, it shuts down. But when those rules shift towards safety, everything starts to open again. So maybe the goal isn't to push harder. Maybe it's to create the conditions where your brain doesn't feel the need to stop you. Because your brain doesn't need more pressure. It needs safety. And that changes how you move forward. Not all at once, not with a complete reset, just something small. Tonight, try the 5-second rule. Don't think about it, just count and move. And before you go to sleep, move your phone out of reach. That's it. Start small, because that's how systems change.